Vincent Price's voice will always be synonymous with Michael Jackson's hit song from the 1980s, Thriller, where we can hear his eerie, spooky voice and the part where he says, "No mortal can resist the evil of the thriller." And he starts laughing at the end of the song, and it's really spooky and creepy. But long before he lent his voice to Michael Jackson's song, he made scores of movies where he frequently played a villain, a dignified man and very genteel, but nonetheless, he was a villain. And his voice caused us to take caution and pause, but simultaneously drew us in. And so tonight, I am going to show you through Vincent Price's numerology grid and his astrology chart why his voice was so eerie and how it caused the success in his career. But he was also a humanitarian. And so we're also going to look at his personality and what he did and why he was a good person. Welcome to the case study tonight of Vincent Price. My name is Brooke. I'm a Vedic numerologist and astrologer. If you haven't yet done so, please subscribe to my channel so you never miss one of my other upcoming videos where I teach you all about Vedic numerology and astrology so you can better understand your life and how to navigate this material plane. Let's get started with the case study of Vincent Price. So Vincent Price made a lot of horror movies, and by today's standards, they, technically don't really count as horror movies. But nonetheless, in the 50s and 60s, he did make a lot of movies, and they were, at the time considered horror movies and very creepy and spooky. He made The Fly, The House on Haunted Hill, The House of Wax. He also did films that were based on Edgar Allan Poe's short stories. So The Mask of the Red Death, The Pit and the Pendulum. He also played the inventor in Edward Scissorhands. That was, I believe, one of his last movies because he did start to become very ill at that point. And his voice was used in one of the Scooby-Doo episodes. He played Vincent Van Ghoul. There also is a voice of him out of The Simpsons, and that is an imitation of his voice. But he has a very prominent voice. So we're going to discuss his Vedic grid first to get a sense of his personality and who he was and what he was like. And then we'll get into his astrology charts and compare the two. And then I'm going to show you why his voice had this very sinister, dynamic way about it. But first, let's look at his grid. So whenever I do a case study, I always start with a Vedic grid so we can understand who a person was. I do have other videos on how to do the Vedic grid, so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, but we take May. That's the 5th month of the year. So we put a 5 here. The 27 from his date of birth, the 2 will go down here. And then the 7 goes in the middle. And if there is a 2-digit number for the birth number, we have to add it up. And then we're going to add 2 plus 7 up. That becomes a 9. And then when we're looking at the century, we don't take the first 2 numbers. We just take the last 2 numbers of the century that someone's born. So that'll be 2 1s. We'll add those here. There is a pattern to where these numbers go. That's where I'm placing them where I am. And then to complete the Vedic grid, we always have to put someone's destiny number in. He had a destiny number of 8. That's just adding every single number up in the date of birth, including all 4 numbers for the century. And so here we have Vincent Price's Vedic grid. So let's just go over a couple of things that I noticed first. So he has a 9 and a 5. This makes someone very intelligent, and he did, in fact, go to Yale. And then the number 9 here, it's very prominent because it's not coming as part of the year that he was born or the month. It's actually his birth number. And so someone having a number 9 as a birth number or destiny number makes them a humanitarian. It makes them want to contribute something larger to society. And he did, in fact, do that. I know he was a huge art collector, and he believed that art should be accessible to everyone, irrespective of their socioeconomic status. And he did donate millions of dollars of artwork to a local college so that there could be access to the enjoyment of art to everyone. I know that he also denounced racial and religious prejudices and said that it tore people apart. He also was one of the first celebrities to make public service announcements about HIV and AIDS to stop fears about it. And that was a big deal, right? Because in the mid 80s, HIV and AIDS was still a very taboo discussion and topic. And so to go out and make public service announcements um, to stop people's fears about it was a huge thing. And so those things, they're just, they give you an idea that he was very much a humanitarian and had the greater good um, at heart. And then we can look down here and we see he has a 2 and an 8 and then ones. Sometimes having a 2 and an 8 in combination with ones can make someone feel that they are better than other people. Frequently, this is due to, being more educated or having more money. And he was highly educated, right, having gone to Yale. But this yoga is not in effect because he has a number 9. And because that was his birth number, it actually negated that yoga of thinking you're better than other people. And so that's nice to see. He did not think that he was better than other people. And then we see the 1, 7, and 8, this line right here that makes someone very intuitive. Now, having 2 1s up here is known as -1. And so there would have been times where he possibly doubted his intuition, but in general, he was very intuitive. 178 yoga is also a yoga for being spiritual, and oftentimes this doesn't come until a little bit later in life, but he did have this. And again, having the 2 1s could have brought some doubt about spirituality, but it was there nonetheless. And then after about the age of 40, this yoga brings more mental peace to people and they understand, why they're here. And it just brings a peace of mind to people. The 178 yoga also would have made him an idealist and then brought in multiple sources of income. And so let's just look a little bit further. We can see that he has the 2 8 down here. There could have been just the 2 and 8 right there. There could have been some depression in his life. Um, it can bring in sadness in someone's life, but fortunately, he doesn't have 2 2s and he doesn't have 2 8s. And so it would have been mitigated, but at times he could have, struggled with some sadness. And then this 2 7 9 yoga. So this is 2 is the moon, 7 is K2, and 9 is Mars. This yoga also makes someone very spiritual, even if they aren't actively practicing spirituality, they know that there is something higher to life. It also can make them incredibly courageous, great leadership skills. And that is something he had. He was very courageous. Again, just, speaking out to not be fearful of AIDS when people were just horrified to even talk about it at the time. And so he had this inherent courage and leadership skills. Now, this 7 5 right here, this created a lot of interesting things in his life. So the 7 is K2 and 5 is Mercury. And so it made him excellent at communication. It made him understand the deeper things in life, especially with the occult, and he was able to communicate those things. The mind would have been very powerful and going a little bit more deeply, which, in fact led to, I think, some of the intensity within him. It also, though, created multiple love affairs within life because it would have created a disinterest within love life to some extent, or you go towards people, but then you realize, that there's something higher. And he did, in fact, have multiple marriages. He was married 3 times. 2 of them ended in divorce. And then his third marriage ended when his wife died. So it creates this really intense way of analyzing things within life. But, it does have the drawbacks of also having some disinterest. And the reason is because the mind, Mercury, is trying to get towards K2, which is spirituality. And then he does have a destiny number of 8. This would have brought in some success within his life. which we know that for a fact. And the eight would have brought in stability. He was trying to create stability within his life and really work towards his karma and what he was meant to do. There would have been some struggle because he did have two ones. Again, this is known as negative one. You want to have just one, to have a sense of ego and self. But having two ones and one of them not being his destiny number would have made him unconfident at times. And so he would have appeared as very confident and refined because one of them's not a destiny, but he actually would struggle with his confidence. And then having just one eight down here, we always want a stable one and then eight to be in control. And so he didn't have a stable one and eight wasn't in control. Two eights would make you in control. And so he was struggling with confidence throughout his life, but he was very aware of what he needed to be doing. And he was just really working in life to try to get to that point. And then the other thing that I want to point out with Vincent Price's grid before we move on to some of his astrology is that he has a seven, a five, and a nine. And so this was going to make his voice very intense and kind of ethereal and otherworldly because he has five, which is our communication, and it's with Mars. And so it's forceful. People with nines and fives sometimes need to watch their words. So he was communicative and it was somewhat forceful, but then it's attached to number seven, which is K2. So it's this forceful, kind of ethereal voice. The following clip that I'm going to play you is from the 1983 movie House of the Long Shadows. It stars Vincent Price and some other famous actors from the time. And by today's standards, it may be a little bit boring. But if you're at all into creepy movies or anything Vincent Price, or, it has a great plot twist at the end. I'm not going to give it away, but it's, I watch it every Halloween. I absolutely love the movie. And so if you're into any of those things, I highly recommend you watch it. You can stream it for a while. I rented it from the video store, I think in the early 90s, and then I couldn't find it for a very long time. And then it is available, through streaming, but I highly recommend you watch it.
I take it you wish to include me within the auspices of this petulant interrogation. In which case, I should explain that my presence here this evening could either be termed as circumstantial or the force of destiny.
So obviously, Vincent Price is a great actor, and you can see how he has that sophisticated way about him. And that is prevalent in all of his movies. But the reason I played that clip for you is because I wanted you to hear how prominent his voice is and how eerie and almost sinister it is, but it draws you in. And the reason this is because of the placement of his 10th house lord and the house in which it is going. And so again, I played that clip to just really emphasize his voice and what the planetary placements are doing and what causes his voice to be that way. Because my hope is that I can show you through numerology and astrology what the planets are doing so that you can learn, if you're curious why someone has a voice the way they do, you can go and look at planets and see what they're doing. So let's get started. I'm going to show you now why his voice has that, that very sinister, haunting sound to it. So this is Vincent Price's birth chart. He was born on May 27th, 1911 at 12:40 a.m. in St. Louis, Missouri. And so remember, I said that his voice had to do with his 10th house lord. And so let's see why. And again, this is per the sidereal system. This isn't Western tropical. You can see that Vincent Price's 10th house lord is ruled by Scorpio, and the ruler of Scorpio is Mars. And it's gone 5 places away, right? One, two, three, four, five. So his 10th house Lord, it's really important to see where that Lord is gone because it's going to give us a lot of clues about a person's career and what they're doing in life. It's gone 5 houses away to his second house. So, first of all, that's a very auspicious placement. Any planet going 5 places away from itself is going to be carrying the energy of the fifth house. And so he would have had speculative gains. There would have been a lot of creativity as well as past life good deeds, because that is what the fifth house entails. So it's going, so there would be past life good deeds and a lot of creativity, but it's going to his second house. And what is the second house? It's speech and it's the way we talk. It's also making money and it's our face. And so his 10th house Lord was going in an auspicious placement 5 houses away into his house of the money that we make, but also our communication. And it's carrying the energy of Scorpio. And that has to do with, right, think of eighth house things. It's death, it's transformation, it's the occult. And so all of that is being carried through the 10th house Lord Mars. And it's going into his second house of how he's making money and of his speech, right? The third house is the house of communication, and then the second house is the house of speech. But we need to look further and see what Mars is doing in the second house. So it's in the nakshatra of Purva Bhadrapada. That's within Pisces. It spans from the end of Aquarius into Pisces. And so that nakshatra has a lot to do with the spiritual fire and burning away materialism. So going in this life away from the materialism and towards spirituality. It's a nakshatra that's known as having 2 faces. And, a lot of people say that people that have either their moon or their ascendant within Purva Bhadrapada are two-faced, that they can act one way and then actually be another, and they say that in a negative connotation. I don't think that inherently people with prominent placements within Purva Bhadrapada are two-faced. I think it has more to do with the fact that they see both sides to an issue, that they can appear to be living, and functioning well within the material world, but they're actually, their mind or who they inherently are is more gravitating towards the spiritual side. Purva Bhadrapada and the 2 faces also has a lot to do with, being able to live in this world, but then look towards death. And then at the end of life, as you're dying, look back and understand what it was to live in the material world. So it is that 2 faces, but I don't take it in a negative connotation. And so let's discuss a little bit more what Purva Bhadrapada is, because it's going to have everything to do with how Vincent Price communicates. So the symbol is the skull and crossbones. And then it has to do, it represents the front legs of the funeral cot and the spiritual fire within us. Once we get to Uttara Bhadrapada, the next nakshatra, that will be sustaining that spiritual fire. But Purva Bhadrapada is going to be much more intense and aggressive because it's trying to burn away materialism. And so it has to do with funerals and death and the occult. It also has to do with endings, right? Because it is the funeral cot. And then, so anything that would entail, mortuaries, cemeteries, poisons, and asylums, it's more dark. It's not so much, getting released to the hospital. It's like going into the hospital and that darkness. It has to do with the occult and tantra and black magic. And so with that, there's also going to be included within this nakshatra horror movies and mysteries. And so Remember that this is the nakshatra that is in Vincent Price's second house, and his 10th Lord has gone there. And so he's going to be speaking about this. This is going to be how he is making money and then sustaining himself, because, right, the second house is going to be how we sustain ourselves within this life. I also wanted to mention in a few minutes, I will be going over Vincent Price's Vedic numerology dashas and why certain things happened when they did in his life. But I just wanted to bring up a few more things on Purva Bhadrapada because it is so important in his life. So let's think about it. His face, he had this very, Mars is there. And so there was a masculinity to his face, right? He was a handsome man with these masculine qualities, but his face was also almost otherworldly or very ethereal looking, as we saw in that clip. And that would be those two faces of Purva Bhadrapada, right? Because it's coming into his second house and it's Mars. So he had this masculine way of looking, but also very spiritual and ethereal. So the material combined with the spiritual. And then with his voice, with Mars going into Purva Bhadrapada Nakshatra, so that is a very non-conformist nakshatra. They march to the beat of their own drum, people that have prominent placements within Purva Bhadrapada. So with his voice being there, it's going to have this non-conformist quality to that, right? And we see that. I mean, he speaks very differently. And then also with Mars and Purva Bhadrapada, he is going to have this very intense, mystical voice, and it's going to have this poetic quality to it. His voice has this distinct way that it is because Purva Bhadrapada does have a lot to do with being distinct again and not conformist, but it's very fiery and passionate, and that's because it's Mars going in there, right? It's not Venus going into Purva Bhadrapada, it's Mars going into Purva Bhadrapada for him. It's very direct and it's very passionate and fiery. And so Vincent Price's voice is carrying this energy of mysticism, right? Because that is, an inherent quality within Purva Bhadrapada. But it's very direct and forceful because Mars is sitting there. But then it's also optimistic because it's sitting in a Jupiter ruled sign, right? Pisces is ruled by Jupiter. And so if you're very familiar with him or you've watched a lot of movies, he has this way of this, ethereal, dark, deep voice, but it's also optimistic. So it's sinister yet optimistic, right? And those are the qualities of Purva Bhadrapada, excuse me. So it's this optimism going towards spirituality, but then it's also it's more dark if you stay in this material dimension of it. And so that is why his voice is so unique. It's carrying these two sides to it, just like the two faces of Purva Bhadrapada. And so that is, really contributing to the success. So remember, the 10th Lord is going into the second house. So please let me know if you have any further questions regarding his Mars and Purva Bhadrapada Nakshatra. Another thing that I wanted to point out that I think is so interesting to do in anyone's chart is to look and see where the destiny number has gone within someone's birth chart. So Vincent Price has a destiny number of 8, and that's ruled by Saturn. So let's look and see where it's gone in his birth chart first before we move on. When we look at our D1 chart and, also our D9 and our D10, we can look and see what someone is meant to do in life. But this takes a little bit of skill and a little bit of practice. And so if you're not well versed on how to really analyze your chart and see what you're meant to do, one really quick tip is that you can see where your destiny number planet has gone. And that is going to give you a huge clue about what you should be doing in life. And you don't need to know a lot about how to figure this out. And so, what you want to do is see it's not even so much the house that the destiny number planet has gone into, it's the nakshatra. And so, even if you don't know a lot about nakshatras, the 27 lunar mansions, you can even just look them up online, right? Calculate your chart, again, per the sidereal system, see what nakshatra your destiny number planet is sitting in. So if your destiny number one, that's ruled by the sun, see what nakshatra the sun is sitting in. And this will be a clue. It's actually not a clue. It's what you need to be doing in life. Want to obviously look at what the higher energies are of that nakshatra and follow that, right? Every nakshatra is going to have lower energies. You want to make sure that you're following per your destiny planet what the higher energies of that nakshatra are. And that's going to give you an idea about what you need to be doing in life. If you're not, able to analyze the D9 or the D10, you can do that. So let's look. So remember that Vincent Price was a destiny number of 8 that's ruled by Saturn. And so here is his Saturn. It was sitting in his third house of communication within Aries in the nakshatra of Bharani. Now, Bharani is that nakshatra's lord is Venus. It's ruled by Venus, right? Sitting in the sign of Mars. So Venus and Mars together, that's very passionate. He was going to be very passionate in communication. And then the degree that his Saturn was sitting in was at 20 degrees, 24 minutes. And so here's, again, we look at the numerology. What does that add up to? The 2 plus the 2 is 4. 4 plus 4 is 8. So the 20 degrees, 24 minutes of his destiny planet sitting in Bharani adds up to 8. And that is what his destiny number is, 8, ruled by Saturn. So you can see this was very karmic for him. He was meant to do something creative because Bharani is all about creation, and acting is a very creative endeavor. You have to really take on the role of the character that you are embodying. And it was sitting in his house of communication. So you can see how it's important to see what the destiny number is doing. Now, the other thing that's so interesting is he was an Aquarius ascendant. Aquarius is ruled by Saturn. And that's also his destiny number, right? So you can see how, powerful Saturn was for Vincent Price. And then where has his ascendant lord gone? It's gone 3 places away. 1, 2, 3, again, into his third house of creativity. His moon was in Kritika Nakshatra, but nonetheless, it was still a conjunction because it's in the same sign, just a different nakshatra. His Mercury was in Bharani as well. So he has all these really prominent planets within Bharani Nakshatra, the nakshatra of creation. And then let's look a little bit further. Let's go back to his second house and see what's happened here. So his second house ruler is Jupiter. And where is Jupiter gone? It's gone into his ninth house within Libra. And so that's, that's a very auspicious placement. It's gone. His second lord has gone into his ninth house, but it's also a little bit tricky. And the reason is because it's gone 8 places away, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's gone 8 places away. And so that placement is going to bring ups and downs. It's going to bring transformation within his life. But it is the second lord going into Libra in the ninth house, and that is with other people, partnerships, balance, and it's with Ketu. And so the second house, the speech, Jupiter, going in, being conjunct with Ketu. And so again, it's bringing this optimistic way of speaking. It's furthering this with Ketu. That is a planet it's the Moksha Karaka. It's of spirituality. And so we can see further why his voice is how it is. If we look, Mars has an eighth aspect. It is on his ninth house as well with Jupiter, which is his second lord of speech. So always remember that whenever a planet is bringing its aspect to another house, it's carrying the energy of the nakshatra that it's placed in. And so Mars's eighth aspect is bringing that energy of Purva Bhadrapada to the ninth house. And again, a tricky position, but also the ninth house is the house of luck and fortune. And so there were going to be ups and downs, but also it's the ninth house. And so it's inherently auspicious. And again, Mars is at eighth aspect, bringing that energy of Purva Bhadrapada, and it's with Ketu. So again, it's this expansive way of communicating. And he did do that because he had a larger than life personality on set, but it's also otherworldly and very ethereal. And then with that eighth aspect, that is, an aspect of transformation, but also the occult and digging deep. And that's going in to his ninth house of fortune. And so the communication was bringing fortune. And then going back to his numerology, let's just again look at number 9 because that's the planet represented by Mars. And Mars is really an important planet for Vincent Price because it is sitting in Purva Bhadrapada with his in his house of speech. So he has 1-9. It's his birth number. And remember that within numerology, our destiny number is what we're meant to do and achieve and who we inherently are. But our birth number, which is 9 for him, are the talents that we come in with through past lives. It's who we think we are. But again, it's our talents. And he has a positive 9. Having 2 nines or more is known as negative 9. It makes you too aggressive in the way that you communicate. It can cause some problems. But 1-9 is positive, and so he has a positive 9, and that shows why he was able to speak in this sinister way, but it wasn't off-putting. It drew people in. And so number 9 is very important to him because going back to his birth chart, that Mars is what's, bringing him money and career success. And then it's positive. He has a positive 9. Now, I want to look a little bit further and let's see what is going on in his third house, because that's the house of communication. So the second house is the house of speech. The third house is the house of communication. But always remember, they're not mutually exclusive. We always have to look at them together, how we communicate and how we're saying it. And so a lot of people, he has Saturn in the third house. It's in Aries, and Saturn and Mars they don't do well together. But, fortunately for Vincent Price, Saturn was his destiny number. The destiny number is always going to help you. So he has that going for him, even though it's within Aries. And then one other thing I wanted to mention within the Kalpurish, the third house is Gemini. And so having Saturn in Gemini, that's okay because Saturn and Mercury are friends. So he has that going for him as well. And then finally, Saturn is within Bharani, ruled by Venus, and Saturn, is exalted within Libra. And so Saturn in Bharani, even though, it doesn't deal well with Mars, Saturn doesn't. It's in within Bharani, and Bharani and ruled by Venus is going to, be okay with Saturn. So sorry, went off on a tangent, but I just wanted to make that be known. But again, he has Saturn in his third house. Saturn in the third house can make someone's voice very harsh and kind of rough and starky. And there's something sometimes a little bit hard about it. But again, we verify that it's doing well for him. But also his ascendant lord is Saturn, and it's his destiny number. So again, Saturn's so prominent for Vincent Price. And then Shata Bishop, his ascendant lord, it's going 3 places away. And so Saturn and Rahu are really going to be prominent for Vincent Price. Now, let's look at the sign of Aries. That's going to be important. It's ruled by Mars. And let's take a look where it's gone. It's gone 12 places away from itself within Purva Bhadrapada Nakshatra again, right? And so his communication being 12, the Lord being 12 places away. So that what is the 12th house? It's losses, it's endings, it's hospitals, but it's also spirituality, it's letting go, it's criminals, and it's our hidden enemies. And so with the Lord of communication going 12 places away, he is going to be communicating about ghosts and criminals and endings and the occult and all that is hidden and need to be dug deep and discovered. And remember, it's in Pisces. And so it's going to have this spiritual, otherworldly flair to what he's communicating about, right? And we know that this is what he's doing in his movies. And it's within Purva Bhadrapada. And so, everything we discussed, black magic, the occult, cemeteries, morgues, and that's what his movies are about. So you can see how his chart is just so set up for the kinds of movies that he made. I do believe his first movie was a comedy, but as you can see, as he moved on, things became more heavily attached to the occult. So now let's look a little further and see how he's feeling about these things. So he has his moon attached to Mercury. And so his mind is going to really be going deep. But we have to see where that, Lord is gone again. He's feeling about the way he's making money and ultimately the career, because that 10th Lord has gone into the second house in Purva Bhadrapada. He's going to be somewhat detached to his money because again, it's the spirituality. The spirituality is coming in more into his life than the material gains. And he was enjoying what he was doing, but he wasn't attached to it all because this Lord is 12 places away, right? From his moon. And so he was, again, even if he was not practicing spirituality, he was very spiritual. He wasn't attached to these things. And so I think that that's really nice about Vincent Price. We see people on television or the movies and they portray themselves one way, but that isn't always who they are. We have to actually look at their numerology and their astrology to see who they inherently are. And he wasn't attached to the money. Oh, and one other thing I forgot. Mars is also the ruler of his 10th house. And it's in the, 5 places away, but nonetheless, it's still, ruled by Mars, and that's 12 places away. And so he just wasn't attached to the material within life or to his communication. I know he was hired because of his voice, but he wasn't attached to that. He probably knew he had this unique voice, but there wasn't this attachment to it. He could see beyond the veil, right? Because that Mars is in Purva Bhadrapada. He was, the spiritual fire was burning and he was breaking down these attachments in this material life. Before we move on to his numerology dashas to see why things happened when they did, let's just take a quick look at his D9 Navamsha chart. So he had Saturn in his 10th house within Libra. And so his Saturn, his destiny number was exalted within Libra in his 10th house. And so Saturn in the 10th house is going to make someone work really hard in their life, especially during the dashas of number 8, really hard. But it's also Saturn in the 10th house is going to make you perfect your craft and your career and come out at the top. And so that goes to show, I mean, of all of the actors in the 50s and 60s that did these horror movies, he really stood out at the top of his craft because Saturn was making him work. If we look at his dashas, he was running his first set of Saturn dashas May 27th, 1948 to May 26th, 1956. And so this would have been just a huge time of having to really work hard. And this was, in fact, when he did make some movies and Saturn was making him work hard, but he perfected his craft, especially during this time. But going back really quickly to his Navamsha, we see that his second lord here, which is Saturn, has gone into his 10th house. And with that second lord going into the 10th house, that's 9 places away, and it's exalted in Libra. So this shows really big career success. And then we see K2 and Jupiter are together in his second house in the Navamsha. Another thing that you can do, a technique that I really like to do, is look and you superimpose the planets from the D1 into the D9 or vice versa. And it gives you an indication of how the planets are being used in life. So if we take his Mars and Purva Bhadrapada from his D1 and then we superimpose it there into his third house and his D9, Mars within Pisces, and it's in his third house of communication. And so while in his D1, his Mars was in his speech, it ultimately, we need to look and see what it was doing in the D9, because that's the fruits. The D9 is the fruits. And it was in his house of communication. And so the way he communicated also was going to carry the energies of Purva Bhadrapada and be about, you know, death and cemeteries and mysticism and black magic and the occult and thrillers and murders and morgues. And so we can see that that's what he was communicating about. And then the Lord of the third house within the Navamsha has gone 12 places away. And so it's with K2. So again, there's this theme of mysticism and all that is sinister in the occult, but it's being expressed in this more optimistic way. And again, if you've seen his movies, you understand what I'm saying. He wasn't like a downer when he spoke and did things. It was somehow he brought you in. And, he almost reminds me of, your grandfather, and there's something mysterious about him, and he draws you in and you want to learn, more of what he's about and what he can teach. And I think, he really does that well in his movies. So now let's take a look at Vincent Price's Mahadashas. Now, numerology has its own set of dashas that we calculate to make predictions. This isn't based on, say, the Vimshotri dasha system. It has its own set of dashas. I have another video on how to calculate them. I'll link it. But I think it's so important to show you this because we can see some of the, bigger things that happened in his life. But also, I think it's important for you to learn how to make predictions in your own life so that you can see what's coming up. I don't see potentials for knowing what's going to happen as bad, because if you see something challenging coming up, then you can understand what's going to happen and you can, make changes and make amends. And it gives you an opportunity to be introspective about what's going to be happening in your life instead of just kind of rolling through life. And then at the end of life, reflecting then. That's not the best time to reflect about life. It's to live life forward, but also be reflective. And so I think that predictions and the dasha cycles are so important to do that. So let's take a look at the first one. So I want to point out that Vincent Price's first film was Service Deluxe in 1938. Here's the dasha. He was running a 6 Venus dasha. And so what we do when someone begins a dasha cycle, either when they begin their Mahadasha, we add in the number that of the planet that corresponds to that Mahadasha, and then we can further look down at the Antar dasha to understand more. But for this video, I'm just going to show you the Mahadashas. Remember, he was running his number 6 Venus Mahadasha. And so we would add this 6 into the grid, and then we analyze from there. So when he was running his 6 Venus dasha, this was May 27th, 1935 to May 26th, 1941. We've added that 6 in, and then we can analyze a little more. So this 6-8 yoga right here brings in a lot of creativity within a person's life, and it really ups their communication level. And so if you think about it, that is when he did his first movie, right? He's really coming out with the communication because he just made a movie. And then this 675 yoga right in the middle, the 675, that brings in the ability to enjoy material pleasures, to enjoy the finer things in life. And so that is probably a time when he had an influx of money coming in and he was able to go out and enjoy the finer things. Keep in mind, we talked about how he is not a very materialistic person, but nonetheless, he did have the ability during this time to enjoy those things. And then sometimes with Purva Bhadrapada, people can be very torn what path to take. This is an analogy of how I see them in life. They are walking down this sterile corridor, and it's very quiet. And from either side, they can see through these glass windows. There's a door to enter either of them. And one side on the right is the material world, and things are lavish, and they can enjoy all of the luxuries in life. And then on the left side is the spiritual side, and it seems more hazy, but they're very drawn to it and they're not sure which direction to go because the material side is calling quite loudly. And then the spiritual side has this fog, this veil, but they're drawn to it as well. And so, and again, this corridor is very quiet and they have to decide where to go. And they are very much walking alone in life. People with Purva Bhadrapada prominent in their grids can become very exasperated in life because they're not sure where to go because people have chosen one path. Most of the people have chosen the material side on the right, but they are alone trying to figure out where to go. And it can be very difficult. Oftentimes people in Purva Bhadrapada do, enjoy the material things in life, but then they ultimately do decide to leave that door and go to the left and go to the spiritual side. And so during this time period, this dasha time period with the 675, when he made his first movie, he would have been experiencing this, enjoying those material things in life, but then ultimately going towards the spiritual side. And then also, if we go back to the dashas, he did run another number 6 Venus dasha that would have been again added into his grid, May 27th, 1980 to May 26th, 1986. This is when he recorded his part in Michael Jackson's Thriller. It was recorded in 1982, but I believe it was released in 1983, but it's nonetheless when he recorded it. And so that 6 would have been added in. Again, it would have brought out creativity and communication. And it did bring a resurgence in his career because, people from the 50s and 60s and 70s were very aware of Vincent Price, but the younger generations then, knew who he was. And with that exposure, it brought in money and brought in the 675 yoga again. And then at 628 yoga of creativity. But nonetheless, this Dasha cycle, when he recorded for Michael Jackson's Thriller, that did bring that resurgence in creativity and communication. And then let's look at the dasha of his death. And in Vimshotri, he was running, I believe it was his Mercury, Mahadasha, and Moon Antardasha. And I'm not going to go over that in this video because I really want to show how you can learn just by looking at the numerology dashas. And it's a more simple way to get an idea of what is happening in life and to make predictions. And so I'm not going to go over the Vimshotri analysis in another video, I may. But during May 27th, 1993 to May 2001, he would have been going through his Saturn dashas. And he did die October 25th, 1993. Now, he was going, I don't have it here, but he was going through his Saturn Antardasha because it was at the beginning of his Mahadasha that he died essentially within the several months. So what we do is we're going to go back to his Vedic grid and plug those numbers in and see why he died during this time. Okay, so essentially what you do is we know that he was running a Saturn Dasha, right? it's Saturn. It's going to be a very important dasha for him. Any dasha of your destiny number that you run is going to be really important. And really quickly, in case you don't know, if you're a one destiny, then you're ruled by the sun. Two is the moon. Three is Jupiter. Four is Rahu. Five is Mercury. Six is Venus. Seven is Ketu. Eight is Saturn. And nine is Mars. Just, in case you're wondering, because I forgot to put up here what numbers correspond with each planet. So he's running his Saturn dasha. So we have to add an eight into the grid. Now, having two eights is known as positive eight. It's still, because it's Saturn, it's still going to cause some struggle, but then there's success after struggle. People with two eights, either in their grid from their birth date or by way of dasha, usually have a lot of wealth. And so when he was running his first set of Saturn dashas right here, 1948 to 1956, he would have made a lot of money. There could have been some health problems right at the beginning of the dasha, but nonetheless, he made a lot of money. But we also have to look and add in his Antar dasha, and this is why he left this material world on October of 1993. He was running also his Saturn Antar dasha. And so we have to add in another eight, because you always add in the Antar dasha as well to really pinpoint those predictions. And so three eighths is negative, and he would have been running this dasha for a little over a year, because when a Mahadasha starts, you run that time period. So we would have started Saturn, and it would have been Saturn Antar dasha. So Saturn, Saturn, and then he would have gone to number 9, which would have been Saturn Mars Antar dasha. But for the first little bit over a year, he was running a Saturn, Saturn Mahadasha Antar dasha, and that is why he died. Because what happens is three number eights are negative. Saturn, even though it was his destiny number and helped him a lot in life, it's still a malefic planet, and having it negative in a Vedic numerology grid is going to be a challenge. And so I've always said this, as long as you live to be at least 45 years old, you're going to go through an entire cycle of dashas, and then you restart. And so people that are older, that are going through their second set of Saturn dashas, oftentimes have significant health problems or they die. Now, I'm not saying that, if you're in your 70s, 80s, 90s, and you're hitting that Saturn dasha, that will bring death. You have to look at everything, but a lot of times, if you're old and you've made it through an entire cycle of dashas, the number 7 K2, the number 8 Saturn, and the number 9 Mars dashas can bring an ending of life. He did die when he was 82, and that's because of these three dashas right here. And so we have to look at it. He has negative ones in his birth grid, and then he has negative eights. Nothing is stable, and Saturn isn't in control of the grid at all. And so that is, what brought his death from a numerological point of view. Now, Saturn at the time that he died was transiting in Capricorn right here in his 12th house. And so they both have a lot to do with endings, right? It was transiting at 29 degrees of Dhanishta. And, Dhanishta has a lot to do with the drums and the hollowness. And I think that this is interesting because it was transiting in his 12th house. There had been, because, a completion of karma, because it's his destiny number. Saturn is also karma and what he was meant to do in life. He had fully integrated the lessons from this material life. And so it's going through Dhanishta at 29 degrees. And now there's a hollowness, right, to the body. I'm not trying to be crass in any way, but his soul is not needing to stay in the body anymore, right? It's able to leave. It's learned all of its lessons, and it can move on now to the next life. Another way to say it is he's now able to leave this life and begin again, whether that's to take a new birth or, if he has fulfilled everything and he's able to achieve moksha after this life, none of us know. But that is what I take that to mean. And then if we go to his Navamsha chart, Saturn would have been transiting at 29 degrees through the first house of his Navamsha. And I always like to look at Navamsha charts to see where planets are transiting. I have found that they almost give even more detail about predictions about what is going to be happening. And then also take note that transiting Saturn, that's in his 12th house, is 10 places away from his natal Saturn. And so that's very karmic as well. And then if you recall, he's running his Saturn dasha. So it's so important to see what Saturn is doing within the transits. That is of the utmost importance. Vedic numerology is a great tool to use, but it is never a standalone from Vedic astrology because the numerology grid comes from the time of birth. And so we can never ignore what is happening within the D1 or the D9. And so with Saturn, it's sitting at in his birth chart at 20 degrees, 24 minutes. Recall that adds up to 8. So Saturn's holding this really intense energy within Vincent Price's life and sitting again 29 degrees of Dhanishta in the 12th house. The most fascinating thing I think about the transits for the day that Vincent Price died is where the moon was transiting. So it was transiting in his first house in Aquarius in Purva Bhadrapada. And keep in mind, it wasn't transiting in Purva Bhadrapada on the Pisces side because this is the house of gains, you know, how we sustain ourselves because it's 2 houses away from the ascendant. The moon is transiting over his ascendant in Purva Bhadrapada. And so it just further illustrates that the spiritual fire is burning. There's the two sides. He's leaving the material side and going towards the spiritual side. So it's an ending of his actual physical body. It wasn't transiting in Purva Bhadrapada in his second house because that's the sustenance. You know, the second house also, you have to look at that for endings within life. But in Vincent Price's case, it's transiting in Purva Bhadrapada. Again, over his first house. And I just think that that's so interesting. And per Vimshotri Dasha, he was running a moon antar dasha. And so, you know, looking at that. And then if we go over to his D9, the moon would have been transiting within Purva Bhadrapada on his second house, so moon and Ketu together. And then the other thing I wanted to show within his birth chart is Venus was transiting the day he died within Virgo. Now, the reason that this is important is because when we look at his ninth house, that's the house of luck and fortune, it's ruled by Venus, Libra is. And so we have to see where the good luck and fortune is going. So we want to see where Venus is. It's 12 places away, right? Sitting in the eighth house, debilitated in Virgo. And so his luck and his fortune had gone 12 places away of endings, debilitated in Virgo. And so you can kind of see we're using the numerology and his grid to see what was going to happen. We know that this is not going to be a good time for him, especially because he's an older man at this point. He has negative eights running, but we want to understand more about what's going to happen. And that's where we can really look to pinpoint the predictions within the astrology. You know, all of our deaths are karmic, but his was highly karmic and fated because of the number 8 and being his destiny number and what was happening at that time. And so always remember to look at the numerology first, because I do think numerology is a lot more simple to pick up. You just need a small background of the astrology, and then you can see what's happening in the numerology and you can get an idea. I mean, this is something you just learned that running 3/8 as a dasha is going to be negative. And then you can go look into the astrology and fine tune what's happening. Always remember, while Vedic numerology will show us so much, we have to go to, the D1 and the D9 to really, hone in on everything. And then we look at the transit. So numerology is never going to be a standalone from the astrology, right? They're together, they're one. So I really hope that this case study was helpful in understanding Vincent Price and a little bit about what he was like. He really did have this illustrious career within the horror film industry of the 50s and 60s. And then it carried on, through TV shows and doing Michael Jackson's Thriller. But there was a lot more to him. He was not this, materialistic man. He cared a lot about other people and the greater good. And inherently, he saw that life is, we have to leave it all behind. He had this, very inherent spiritual quality to him. And I think it really came out in his voice, especially. What I decided to start doing with these case studies is at the end of each case study is saying, what would the person be like if you just walked up to them on the street? How would they treat you? Because, we can assume someone is a certain way or how they are in their movies, but the numbers don't lie. And how people appear to be is not always who they are. So Vincent Price is going to be the first person that we do this with. So how would he be if you just walked up to him and approached him on the street? So he wouldn't be overly warm because he had a 2 and an 8. But he would be very polite and very cordial and very interested and engaged in what you were talking about with him and what you had to say. He wouldn't act like he was better. He would want to hear what you thought about life. And the more deep that you got into conversation with him, the more intrigued he would be because he wasn't superficial, and having these kind of superficial conversations would not have been something that he would be interested in. If you were to tell him that there was an idea you had to help an organization, he would be very intrigued by that and would probably ask what he could do to help. And then ultimately, if you became friends with him and once you really got to know him, he would very much open up to you and be there for you. So I hope that this was helpful and that you enjoyed this video. Please let me know if you have any questions and what your favorite Vincent Price movie or TV show was. And if it was Thriller by Michael Jackson and you saw the video, or even just the song, let me know if it was that as well. Because again, my favorite movie was House of the Long Shadows, and I highly recommend that you watch it, especially if you like, those older movies and plot twists. And there's some really great actors in there as well. Thank you so much for watching. And again, if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so you never miss another video. And I will see you soon. Bye.